The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and Margaret Ralston read it twice before she folded it neatly into the pocket of her apron and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel afraid. She had been working as a nurse out of Abilene, Kansas, for 3 years by then, taking whatever cases came her way: cholera victims, ranch hands with broken bones, a schoolteacher's infant who had fought a fever for 9 terrible days and won. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a kind of practical courage that some men mistook for coldness, until the moment they were lying flat on their backs and realized it was the only thing standing between them and a pine box. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely away from her face during working hours, green eyes that could read a patient's color the way a sailor reads weather, and hands that were always steady, even when her heart was not. The telegram was from a lawyer named Horace Beecham, who represented the estate of one Clyde Doyle, described as a cattle baron of considerable means operating out of the Texas Panhandle, a man who was reportedly dying of a fever that had settled into his lungs after a long winter of driving cattle through freezing rain. Beecham had heard of Margaret through a physician in Abilene named Dr. Garrett, who had apparently vouched for her with enough enthusiasm to make her blush if she had been the blushing kind. The terms were generous, more than generous. $50 a month plus room and board on the Doyle Ranch, which Beecham described as one of the largest private land holdings in Deaf Smith County. The position was expected to last, he wrote delicately, no more than 6 to 8 weeks. Margaret understood what that meant. They were not hiring a nurse. They were hiring someone to make a dying man comfortable. She packed her medical bag, her 2 good dresses, her nursing kit, her copy of Dr. Roberts' Handbook of Practical Medicine, the 1878 edition, which she knew nearly by heart, and a small framed photograph of her mother, who had died of consumption when Margaret was 19, and who had inadvertently set her daughter on this path by making her watch helplessly for 2 years before the end came. Margaret had decided that day that she would never be helpless again if she could help it. She had apprenticed with Dr. Garrett for 4 years after that, learning everything he could teach her, and a good deal more that she had figured out on her own. She took the southbound train from Abilene to Amarillo, then hired a wagon driver named Pete Ochoa to take her the rest of the way out to the Doyle Ranch, which sat at the end of a long red dirt road bordered by mesquite and the occasional wind-bent cottonwood. The land opened up around her as they traveled, enormous and unforgiving under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and Margaret felt the familiar mixture of awe and solitude that the Texas plains always stirred in her. "You the nurse they sent for?" Pete asked. He was a lean, brown-faced man of about 50 with a sun-cracked mouth and kind eyes. "I am," Margaret said. "They say he's bad off." Clyde Doyle. Pete shook his head. "Shame. Man built that ranch from nothing. His daddy left him 40 acres and a mule, and now he's sitting on 60,000 head and God knows how many acres. Man works like the devil himself is keeping score." "How old is he?" Margaret asked. 41, maybe 42 now." Margaret nodded, absorbing this. Not old, then. Not some ancient patriarch whose time had simply come. A man in his middle years, struck down before he should have been. That made it both more urgent and, in a way she would not have admitted to anyone, more sad. The Doyle Ranch house came into view around a bend in the road, and Margaret found herself sitting up straighter without meaning to. It was a substantial 2-story structure built of pale limestone, larger and more solidly constructed than she had expected, with a long covered porch running the length of the front and several outbuildings arranged behind it, with the orderly logic of a man who liked things done right. There were horses in a near pasture, beautiful animals, well kept, and several ranch hands moving through the yard with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew their work. Everything about the place spoke of a competence that extended from the soil to the rooftop. A small, round woman in a gray dress came out of the front door the moment the wagon pulled up, wiping her hands on a towel and looking at Margaret with an expression that combined hope with a desperate kind of relief. "You must be Miss Ralston," she said. "I'm Edna Potts. I keep the house. Thank the Lord you've come." "He's been worse the last 2 days, and Dr. Farlow from Hereford rode out last week, but he said there wasn't much more he could do, and Mr. Doyle told him to get out, which he did, and since then it's just been me and the boys trying to keep him from well." She stopped herself. "Come inside. I'll take you up." The house was clean and well-ordered, with high ceilings and wooden floors covered with woven rugs, and it smelled of wood smoke and something medicinal that told Margaret someone had been trying turpentine steam, which was better than nothing but not by much. She followed Edna up a staircase and down a hallway to a closed door at the far end. Edna knocked twice and opened it without waiting. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and the air inside was thick and close in the way that sick rooms always were when no one had thought to open a window. Margaret's eyes adjusted quickly. There was a large brass bed against the far wall, and in it lay a man who was unmistakably fighting for his life. He was tall, she could see that even lying flat, the length of him stretching nearly to the footboard, with dark hair plastered to a pale forehead, and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. He was breathing with the shallow, labored quality that Margaret associated with deep pulmonary congestion, each breath a visible effort, and his color was off, not quite gray, but not the color of a healthy man either. His eyes were closed, but even sick, even diminished by fever and struggle, there was something about him that was hard to ignore. The breadth of his shoulders, the strong architecture of his face, the sense even in his stillness of a man who was accustomed to filling whatever space he occupied. Margaret set her bag on the chair beside the bed and opened the window immediately. From the bed came a low, rough voice. "Close that." "I won't," Margaret said pleasantly. "You need fresh air more than you need quiet, Mr. Doyle." A pause. Then, from the bed, "Who the devil are you?" "Margaret Ralston. I'm the nurse Mr. Beecham sent for." She was already unclipping her stethoscope from her bag. "I'm going to listen to your lungs now. Try not to argue with me while I do it." Another pause, longer this time. She put the stethoscope to his chest and listened carefully, and what she heard was not good, but it was not hopeless either. There was significant congestion in the lower left lobe, some wheezing in the right, but the heart was strong, surprisingly strong for a man this sick. Whatever was in his lungs had not yet reached his heart, and that was the crack in the door she intended to throw wide open. She straightened and looked at his face. He had opened his eyes while she was listening, and she found herself meeting a pair of dark eyes that were sharp and observant despite everything, watching her with an intelligence that had not been dulled by sickness. They were striking eyes, deep brown, almost black, with a directness to them that she found unexpectedly steadying. "Well," he said, "your lungs are badly congested, and you have a fever of approximately 103 degrees, which I'll confirm once I get my thermometer out," she said. "You also look like you haven't eaten properly in a week and you're dehydrated. None of this is ideal." "Thank you for that assessment," he said, with a dry edge to his voice that told her this was a man who, even at his worst, would not entirely lose his sense of himself. "However," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken, "your heart sounds good and strong, and you're conscious and capable of being disagreeable, which suggests there's more fight left in you than Dr. Farlow apparently believed. I'm going to treat you aggressively for the lung infection with steam inhalations and a poultice, and I'm going to start you on a regimen of fluids and broth today. You'll hate most of what I ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to do it anyway." He stared at her for a long moment. "Farlow said there was nothing more to do." "Dr. Farlow was wrong," Margaret said simply, and opened her bag to find her thermometer. She heard something that might almost have been a laugh, short and airless, from the direction of the bed. "All right, Miss Ralston," he said. "Have at it." The next 2 weeks were the most exhausting and demanding of Margaret's professional life. The lung infection was severe pneumonia in the lower left lobe, with the right beginning to show signs of following suit, and the fever refused to break cleanly, rising and falling in a stubborn pattern that tested every technique in her arsenal. She sat with him through 3 consecutive nights when the fever spiked dangerously, applying cool cloths and forcing water into him, with a patience that was absolute because it had to be. She prepared steam inhalations with eucalyptus oil she sent Pete Ochoa into Hereford to find, and she had Edna Boyle mustard poultices and applied them to his chest twice daily until he protested so strenuously that she reduced it to once, which she had intended all along. She slept in the room across the hall when she slept at all, her door open so she could hear if his breathing changed in the night. She kept a journal of his temperature and his color and the sounds of his lungs, noting every small shift, charting the pattern of the illness the way she would chart a river, looking for the moment it would turn. Through it all, Clyde Doyle was difficult. He was not cruel. He was never cruel, but he was a man who had run his own affairs for a long time and answered to no one, and having a woman in his bedroom ordering him to drink willow bark tea and lie still while she pressed her ear to his chest was clearly an experience for which nothing in his life had prepared him. He argued with her about the steam treatments. He tried on the 5th day to get out of bed to meet with his foreman about a fence line, and Margaret planted herself between him and the door with a calm firmness that stopped him in his tracks. "You can meet with your foreman from that bed," she said. "I will send for him myself, but you are not getting up." He looked at her, just looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the battle happening behind those dark eyes, the pride fighting the exhaustion, fighting the awareness that she was, in fact, right. "Fine," he said, and got back into bed, which was when she understood that whatever else Clyde Doyle might be, he was not a fool. His foreman, a weathered, barrel-chested man of about 50 named Roy Stanton, came up the stairs with his hat in his hand and stood at the doorway discussing cattle and fence lines, and a water rights dispute with a neighboring rancher named Fletcher, while Margaret sat in the corner and pretended to read and listen to everything, because understanding what was worrying her patient was, she had long since learned, as important as understanding his fever. Roy left after half an hour and Clyde lay back against his pillow with his eyes closed, and Margaret could see from the set of his jaw that the water rights situation was eating at him. "Tell me about the Fletcher problem," she said. He opened one eye. "You were listening. I was in the room. Was I supposed to put my hands over my ears?" He was quiet for a moment. "Fletcher's been diverting water from the creek that feeds my south pasture, claims it runs through his land first, so he's entitled. My lawyers say otherwise. And you can't do anything about it while you're lying here." "No." "Then stop thinking about it," she said. "Worry costs energy you can't afford to spend right now." Roy Stanton looks like a man who knows what he's doing. Clyde opened both eyes this time. "He is," he said, and something in his expression shifted, a small, surprised softening, as if he had not expected her to say something sensible. "Good," Margaret said, and went back to her book. By the end of the first week, she had allowed herself to begin to think that he might actually survive. By the end of the second, she was nearly certain of it. The fever broke on a Thursday morning, properly broke, leaving him drenched and exhausted but cool to the touch and breathing more freely than he had in weeks. Margaret sat at his bedside and felt the particular deep satisfaction of that moment, the moment when the body stops losing and starts winning, and she pressed her fingers lightly to his wrist to feel his pulse and found it steady and strong. He was asleep when the fever broke. He slept for 14 hours after that, deep and genuine sleep, not the fitful burning half-consciousness of fever, and when he woke it was late afternoon and the low Texas sun was cutting long golden lines through the curtains that Margaret had finally left half open because he was well enough now that the light would not hurt him. He looked at her from across the room, where she was writing in her journal at the small desk by the window, and he said, "It broke." "It did," she said, without looking up. "How long ago?" "This morning, early." She set down her pen and turned to look at him. His color was better. Not good, not yet, but so markedly improved from the gray-white of 3 days ago that the difference was like watching a lamp being turned up. How do you feel? He considered the question with the seriousness of a man who was used to honest self-assessment. Like I've been dragged behind a horse, he said, but present, more present than I've been. That's the fever lifting. You'll feel weak for a while. Your body has been fighting hard for 2 weeks and it needs time to recover. She crossed the room and picked up her stethoscope and listened to his lungs again, and what she heard made her close her eyes for a brief moment of simple gratitude. Still rough, still not right, but vastly improved. The lower left lobe was opening, the right was clear. Better, he asked. Considerably better, she straightened. You're not out of the woods, another week in bed at minimum and then very limited activity for another 2 or 3 after that. No riding, no meeting about fence lines from horseback, no pretending you're well before you are. You have a very low opinion of my self-discipline, he said. I have a realistic opinion of it, she said. You tried to get out of bed on the 5th day. Something that was definitely a smile crossed his face, brief, lopsided, and entirely unexpected in how much it changed his appearance. It made him look younger. It made him look like someone she had not quite seen before, in all the hours she had spent in this room watching him fight to breathe. Fair, he said. Edna brought up a tray that evening with broth and cornbread and a small pot of honey, and for the first time in 2 weeks Clyde Doyle sat up in bed and ate like a man who intended to live, and Margaret sat in the chair across the room and watched him do it, and felt something she did not immediately name settle quietly in her chest. The days that followed were a different kind of work, not the desperate, exhausting combat of the acute phase, but the patient, slower labor of recovery. She continued his steam treatments, though less frequently. She supervised his diet carefully, insisting on regular small meals and plenty of water, and the willow bark tea that he had finally stopped complaining about with any great enthusiasm. She walked with him to the end of the hallway, and back on the first day he was allowed out of bed, holding his arm as he moved with the deliberate, careful steps of a tall man who had temporarily forgotten how to trust his own legs. And somewhere in those days, without either of them quite intending it, they began to talk. It started with small things, his observations about the ranch, her responses, the weather, the way the light changed on the plains in the late afternoon. Then it grew. He told her about coming to the Texas Panhandle in 1869 as a young man of 28 with 40 acres and a small inheritance from his father that had not stretched nearly as far as he had hoped. She told him about learning to nurse, about the long nights with Dr. Garrett in the lamplit office in Abilene, about the cases that had broken her heart and the ones that had put it back together again. He told her about the winter cattle drive of 1880, which had cost him 1,200 head and very nearly his life, when he had pushed on through a blizzard against his own better judgment. She told him about the cholera outbreak of 1879, when she had worked for 3 weeks without proper rest and lost 4 patients in a single day and went home and cried until she had nothing left and then got up the next morning and went back. He listened when she talked. She had noticed that about him early on, the quality of his attention, the way he did not glance away or wait for a pause to make his own point, but simply listened with his dark eyes steady on her face, absorbing what she said as if it mattered. It was uncommon enough in a man that she noticed it, and he was funny, which she had not expected. Not the broad, theatrical humor of a man performing himself for an audience, but a dry, quiet wit that surfaced unexpectedly and always caught her off guard, and which she found, after the first few times it happened, that she was beginning to anticipate with a pleasure she could not entirely account for. On the 12th day of his recovery, he was well enough to sit on the porch in the late afternoon, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild spring weather at Margaret's insistence, and she sat beside him in the other chair, and they watched the sun drop toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and copper and deep rose. The land stretched out before them, enormous and quiet, and the sound of cattle in the distance drifted to them on the warm wind. "I owe you my life," he said. You owe yourself your life, she said. You fought, I just tried to make sure you had something worth fighting toward. He turned to look at her. That's a generous way to put it. It's the accurate way. He was quiet for a moment. Farlow told me in February that it would be a matter of weeks. He said to put my affairs in order. Well, Margaret said, he was wrong about that too. He was. Clyde looked out at the plains again. I spent 3 weeks after he told me that thinking about what I'd leave behind, whether any of it mattered, whether I'd done anything worth a damn with the time I'd had. He paused. Not a comfortable 3 weeks. No, she said softly. I imagine not. The land matters, he said. The cattle, the ranch, yes, those matter. But I kept thinking about the men who work for me. Roy's been with me 15 years. There are 3 other hands who have been here nearly as long. Their families live on this land. I kept thinking about what would happen to them. Margaret looked at his profile in the fading light, the strong jaw, still slightly sharper than it had been before the illness, the line of his brow, the way he held himself even wrapped in a blanket, with a kind of natural authority that was not arrogance but simply the bearing of a man who knew his own mind. They have a good man looking out for them, she said, and meant it entirely. He turned to look at her again, and the expression on his face was one she could not quite read, open, searching, perhaps slightly vulnerable in a way that she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. Thank you, he said, for what you did. That's what I was hired to do, she said. No, he said. You were hired to watch me die comfortably. You decided to do something considerably more inconvenient. Margaret laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he smiled at the sound of it, that same lopsided, unexpected smile that she had been cataloging without quite realizing she was doing it. The following week brought a change in the rhythm of things. Clyde was now well enough to receive Roy Stanton daily, to review the ranch accounts that Beecham sent out from town, and to take short walks along the perimeter of the yard. He no longer needed the intensive nursing care of the acute phase, and Margaret knew, with a practicality that she was trying hard to make peace with, that her professional purpose here was drawing toward its conclusion. She had begun to think about what came next. There was a case waiting in Abilene, a woman in the late stages of a difficult pregnancy whose doctor wanted a nurse present. There was always something waiting in Abilene. Margaret's life had been organized around one case, and then the next for 3 years. A kind of perpetual forward motion that had served her well, and kept her from thinking too much about the fact that she went home each evening to a boarding-house room with a narrow bed and a view of the tannery. She was thinking about this one evening after supper, sitting on the porch alone while Clyde was inside going over his accounts with Roy, when the front door opened, and Clyde came out and settled into the chair beside her with the careful movements of a man who was still conserving his strength but no longer rationing it. "You're thinking about leaving," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "I didn't say anything. You've had a particular expression for the past 3 days, an inward look like you're already somewhere else." She was quiet for a moment. "My work here is nearly done," she said. "That's the way of it. I go where I'm needed." "Where will you go next?" "Back to Abilene. There's a case waiting." He nodded slowly, looking out at the darkening land. The first stars were beginning to show in the eastern sky, faint and cold above the horizon. The wind had dropped with the sun, and the evening was very still. And after that, "Another case," she said. "That's how it works." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was measured and thoughtful, as if he had been thinking about what he wanted to say and was choosing each word with care. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm asking honestly and not in any way that should make you uncomfortable." Margaret turned to look at him directly. "All right. What do you plan to do with the rest of your life, Margaret?" The question landed differently than she had expected. It was not a small question asked carelessly. She could see from his face that he meant it in the largest possible sense, and the largeness of it struck her somewhere she had not been struck in a long time. She had been so focused on the next case, the next patient, the next illness to fight, that the larger question, The one about whether this forward motion was leading her somewhere she actually wanted to go, or simply away from somewhere she was afraid to stay, had not presented itself to her clearly in years. "I haven't entirely decided," she said, which was more honest than she had intended to be. He held her gaze. "3 weeks ago I was lying in that room, and I genuinely believed I was going to die. And one of the things that became very clear to me in that time was that I had spent 20 years building something that was extraordinary in certain ways and entirely empty in others." He looked down at his hands. "The land is good, the work is good, but I've been alone in this house for a long time, and I won't say content with that because the honest word is accustomed. I got accustomed to it, the way you get accustomed to a stone in your boot when you've been walking long enough." Margaret said nothing. She waited. "You are the most capable, clear-minded, and genuinely courageous person I have encountered in a very long time," he said. "You walked into my sick room and decided to argue with death on my behalf, and you won. And you did it with a steadiness and a grace that I find remarkable." "Mr. Doyle," she began. "Clyde," he said, not sharply but firmly. She paused. "Clyde, I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight," he said. "I'm asking you honestly whether you might consider the possibility of staying, not because I'm still sick, not because I need a nurse, but because—" He stopped, and she could see the effort it cost him, this man who was accustomed to running his own counsel and not explaining himself to anyone. "Because when you laughed that first time on the porch, I realized I had been listening for that laugh every day, and I had not known until I heard it that I had been listening." The honesty of it was so complete and so unguarded that it stilled her entirely. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been a stranger to her 6 weeks ago, who had been her patient, who had been difficult and proud and unexpectedly funny, and now sat here in the gathering dark asking her the biggest possible question with his whole face open and uncertain, and more human than any man she had seen in a very long time. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," he said without a trace of pressure. "Take whatever time you need." She went inside shortly after that and climbed the stairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time without lighting the lamp. She thought about her narrow bed in Abilene. She thought about her mother, who had died at 43 without ever once, in all the years Margaret had known her, looked like a woman who had gotten what she wanted from the life she'd been given. She thought about the expression on Clyde Doyle's face on the porch, the openness of it, the absence of pretense, the way a man who ran 60,000 acres and employed 40 hands had sat there in the dark and told her that he had been listening for her laugh. She thought about his lungs the morning the fever broke, and how she had closed her eyes in a moment of pure gratitude, and she wondered now if some of that gratitude had already been about more than the professional satisfaction of saving a life. She slept fitfully and woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life below her horses, the distant bawl of cattle, the low voices of ranch hands crossing the yard, and she made herself face the question honestly, without the protection of practicality. She was 38 years old, not 20. Wait, she stopped herself. She was 28. She had always been too old in her own mind. She knew that about herself. She was 28 years old, and she had spent 4 years learning to be a nurse and 3 years practicing it, and she had been good at it and proud of it, and it had been real and meaningful work. But she had been alone for all of it, and loneliness was something she had gotten very skilled at not admitting to herself, the way you develop a skill for anything you practice long enough. And here was a man, a real man, flawed and difficult, and recovering from an illness that had nearly killed him, with a water rights dispute on his hands and a ranch the size of a small county to run, who had sat in the Texas dark and told her he had been listening for her laugh. She went down to breakfast with her mind not entirely made up, but the direction of her thinking considerably clearer than it had been when she went to bed. Edna was at the stove, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and biscuits, and Clyde was already at the table with Roy Stanton, both of them bent over what appeared to be a survey map. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did not change markedly, but she caught the slight shift, a kind of contained attention, like a man carefully not hoping. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She poured her coffee and sat down across from them and said to Roy, "Is that the Fletcher property line?" Roy blinked at her. Clyde looked at her with something that was part surprise and part amusement. "It is," Roy said cautiously. "And the creek runs along here." She pointed at a line on the map. Roy looked at Clyde. Clyde gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "That's right," Roy said, "and Fletcher's diversion is here." "Yes, ma'am." "There was a case in Abilene 3 years ago," Margaret said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "A farmer named Kessler took a neighboring property to court over a water diversion. The court ruled based on prior appropriation. Whoever had established use of the water first had the prior right. Has Mr. Beecham looked into when the Doyle Ranch first began using this creek?" Both men stared at her. "I don't know that he has," Clyde said slowly. "It might be worth asking him," Margaret said, and took a sip of her coffee. Roy looked at Clyde with an expression that was 3 parts impressed and 1 part bewildered. Clyde was looking at Margaret with an expression that was none of those things and entirely something else. "I'll write to Beecham today," Clyde said. They ate breakfast together, all of them, which was not something that had happened before. Roy and Margaret and Clyde around the big kitchen table, with Edna bringing out biscuits and refilling coffee, and occasionally inserting herself into the conversation in the way of a woman who had run a household long enough to understand that she was the actual organizing intelligence of the operation. The conversation wandered from the water rights to the spring calf count to whether the new section of fence Roy had been putting in on the South Range was going to hold through the summer, and Margaret listened and occasionally asked a question and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, like she belonged in this room. After Roy left, Clyde poured himself a second cup of coffee and looked at her across the table. "You know about water law," he said. "I know about the Kessler case," she said. "I nursed old Kessler through a broken hip in 1879, and he talked about that case for 3 weeks. He was very pleased with the outcome." Clyde smiled. "I imagine he was." "Clyde," she said. He went still, very deliberately still, as if steeling himself. "I've been thinking about what you asked me last night," she said. "I know you have," he said. "I could hear it. You could not hear me thinking. You have a way of being quiet that is very loud," he said, which made her laugh despite herself, and which made his expression do that thing she had begun to watch for, that warm and slightly wondering quality, as if her laugh was a small and unexpected gift every time. She set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." "All right. I have been on my own for a long time," she said. "I have been good at it. I have liked a great deal of it, and I am not a woman who is going to arrive at any decision about her own life because she is afraid of continuing to be on her own. I want you to understand that." "I do understand it," he said quietly. "I would not want it any other way. But I have also been honest with myself this morning about the fact that alone is not the same as content," she said, "and that I have been very skilled at confusing the two." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. "You asked me what I plan to do with the rest of my life. I think the honest answer is that I don't want to spend it moving from one case to the next without anyone to come home to." The room was very quiet. Through the window she could hear the sound of the ranch going about its morning business, horses and cattle, and the distant clang of something metal in the yard. "I am not asking you to decide anything today," he said, with a care that moved her. "I'm asking if you'll give us, the idea of us, a genuine chance. Stay a while longer, not as my nurse." "Just stay, all right," she said. The word dropped between them with the quiet weight of a real commitment, and she watched it land on his face, that particular stillness of a man who has been told something he had feared he would not hear, and who is trying to receive it without making any dramatic gesture that might disturb it. "All right," he said. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most vivid of Margaret's experience, and she meant strange in the best possible way. She had spent 3 years moving through the lives of sick people, permitted entrance to the most intimate and frightened moments of their existence, but always as a visitor, always understanding that she would leave. Being here now without that defined purpose felt at first like standing in a room with all the furniture moved, familiar in its dimensions but unfamiliar in its arrangement. But she adjusted, because she had always been good at adjusting to circumstances. She began to take walks with Clyde in the mornings when the weather was good, first short ones around the yard, then longer ones out into the pastures as his strength continued to return. She learned the land, the creek that crossed the south pasture, the stands of cottonwood along its banks where cottonwood-leaf trees threw green shadows in the heat of the day, the low hills to the north that turned gold in the late afternoon light. She learned the names of the horses and the particular temperaments of the ranch hands, and the way the cook named Carlos made coffee so strong it could wake the dead, which she appreciated enormously. She also began to understand the scale of what Clyde had built here, and it was genuinely impressive. Not just the land and the cattle, but the systems and relationships, the long-standing loyalties, the way the hands talked about him with a respect that was entirely unperformed, the careful organization that kept a 60,000-acre operation running smoothly. He was not a man who simply owned land. He was a man who knew how to steward it. One afternoon in late May, 3 weeks after her conversation with him at the breakfast table, she was sitting under the cottonwood trees by the creek while he stood nearby watching Roy and 2 of the younger hands work on the fence line. And she was reading, or pretending to read, actually watching him from behind the cover of her book with a self-awareness that she found both amusing and slightly alarming. He turned and caught her at it because he was that kind of observant, and she lowered the book without embarrassment and looked at him steadily, and he walked over and sat beside her in the grass with a case that his body now moved with again, the ease of a man in full health, and the difference from the labored, careful movement of the early recovery weeks was complete. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the spine. He squinted at it. "A medical journal. It keeps me current," she said. "You read medical journals for recreation. I find them interesting," she said. "Don't you find things about cattle management interesting?" "Yes, but I don't read about it for recreation. He stopped. "Actually, I do," she laughed. He grinned, that broad, full grin that she had seen appear with increasing frequency over the past weeks and which she had concluded was one of the better sights available on the Texas plains. "You're laughing at me again," he said. "I'm laughing with you," she said. "There's a distinction. There doesn't seem to be from where I'm sitting." She set the journal down and looked at the creek, which was running clear and quick over its limestone bed, catching the light in little sparks. "Clyde, the Fletcher situation, has Beecham found anything?" "He has, actually." He stretched his legs out in front of him. "The ranch has been using that creek since 1871. Fletcher's family only acquired their land in 1876. Beecham says prior appropriation is very much on our side." "Good," she said, with a satisfaction that was part practical and part something more personal. She had helped with that, and it mattered. He looked at her profile. "You've been good for this ranch," he said. "You've been asking the right questions." "I ask a lot of questions in general. I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "When I was in that bed in the worst of it, I had a dream that I was out here by this creek and it was completely dry, empty. The cattle were gone. The house was standing but dark and no one was in it. And I walked through the whole property and there was nothing alive anywhere." He paused. "I woke up from that dream in a cold sweat, and I remember thinking, not about the cattle, not about the land. I remember thinking, she's still here. And I knew somehow even in that fever state that you were across the hall and that as long as you were there, I was not entirely gone." Margaret was very quiet for a moment. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was so entirely unguarded that something in her chest ached with the simple truth of it. "I'm still here," she said. "I know," he said. "I am grateful every morning that you are." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the grass, and he turned his hand and took hers and held it with a steady warmth. And they sat there in the shade of the cottonwood trees, listening to the creak and the sound of the ranch and the enormous sky above them, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. The summer came in hot and fast the way Texas summers did, a wall of heat arriving seemingly overnight, turning the range brown and gold and making the air shimmer at the edges of things. Margaret had by now been at the Doyle Ranch for nearly 4 months, and it had become, with a naturalness that she was still occasionally amazed by, her home in a way that no place had been since she was a girl. She had written to Abilene to explain that she would not be returning, a letter that had required 2 drafts because the first one was too apologetic and the second was more honest. Dr. Garrett had written back with generous warmth, saying that he had seen this coming when he vouched for her, which was not true but very kind, and wishing her happiness. The boarding house had released her deposit without complaint. She continued to practice her nursing in an informal capacity, because old habits do not dissolve even when their context changes. The ranch hands knew that the nurse was there, and came to her occasionally with the pragmatic directness of working men. A hand named Wesley, with an infected cut on his palm that required draining and stitching, young Daniel Torres, who was the youngest of the hands at 18, and had developed a rattling cough in the late spring that she treated aggressively and cleared before it could become anything more serious. Roy Stanton's persistent complaint about his right knee that she could not cure, but could manage with a combination of willow bark tea, and a specific set of exercises she had learned from a physician in Abilene who had studied in Boston. Clyde watched her do all of this with an expression she had learned to read, a mixture of pride and something softer, something she could not entirely name, but felt in the way he would sometimes simply stand in the doorway watching her work, as if the sight of her was enough to make him still. One evening in late June, they were sitting on the porch in the blue dusk, the heat of the day finally releasing its grip on the land, and Clyde said, with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about something for a while, "I'd like to ask you something properly." She set down her glass of water and looked at him. In the fading light his face was very clear and very serious, and she felt a warmth move through her that was entirely separate from the Texas summer. "My life is here," he said, "on this land. I have no intention of going anywhere and no desire to. I want to ask you if your life could be here too, not as a guest, not as a nurse, not as a woman you took on out of circumstance." He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band set with a small dark garnet, unpretentious and exactly right, the choice of a man who understood what mattered. "I want you here as my wife, Margaret. I want to know that when I wake up every morning you're in the house. I want to sit at that breakfast table with you every day for the rest of my life. I want the rest of my life to be spent with you in it." She looked at the ring and then at his face, and she was aware that this was one of those moments that divided time into before and after, and she knew with absolute certainty, the same certainty she brought to her diagnosis of a fever, the same unshakable clarity she had when she listened to a pair of lungs and knew what she was hearing, which side of this moment she wanted to be on. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger and the fit was very slightly loose. He had guessed, she realized, and had probably asked Edna, and Edna had probably guessed too, because Edna was perceptive and had been watching the two of them with an expression of restrained delight for weeks. She made a note to have it sized. Then she stopped thinking about the ring and looked at Clyde, who was still holding her hand, and she leaned forward and kissed him for the first time, gently, and felt his hand tighten around hers with a careful, wondering tenderness that told her everything she needed to know about him. They were married in September of 1882 in the town of Hereford, at the small Methodist church that stood on the main street between the general store and the post office. The ceremony was performed by a Reverend Harold Barnes, who was a thin, earnest man with a great fondness for scripture and a thorough understanding of how to read a room, and who kept the service shorter than he might otherwise have done, because he could see from the expression on the groom's face that this was a man who had already decided everything and simply wanted it made official. Roy Stanton stood as witness, scrubbed and solemn in his good suit, which he wore with the particular discomfort of a man who owns one. Edna Potts sat in the front pew in a navy dress with a small hat pinned to the front of her gray hair, and cried with a thoroughness and a lack of self-consciousness that was, Margaret later said, the most honest response to the ceremony she could have imagined. Young Daniel Torres, who had recovered fully from his spring cough, and was grateful enough for this that he had become something of a quiet champion of Margaret's presence on the ranch, had driven the wagon himself to bring the small party into town, and stood outside the church during the ceremony holding the horses with an expression of tremendous dignity that made him look considerably older than 18. Margaret wore her better dress, the deep green one that she had brought in her trunk from Abilene, and had allowed Edna to fix her hair in a style that was somewhat less severe than her usual working arrangement. She carried a small bouquet of wild prairie flowers that Edna had assembled that morning, and she walked into that church on no one's arm, because she had been on her own a long time, and she found she wanted the walk to the front to be her own choice, entirely, with nothing supporting her but herself. Clyde was standing at the front of the church, and when she came through the door his face did something that she would remember for the rest of her life, opened, wholly, with an expression that was not just happiness but a kind of profound relief, as if some long-held tension had finally, completely, let go. Reverend Barnes said the words. They said the words back. The ring was properly sized by then, and it slid onto her finger as if it had always been meant to be there. Clyde kissed her in front of Roy and Edna and Reverend Barnes and God, and Roy made a sound that was not quite clearing his throat and not quite something else, and Edna abandoned all pretense of composure entirely. They went back to the ranch that afternoon, and Edna had somehow managed to prepare a proper wedding supper with the help of Carlos and one of the other hands' wives, a capable woman named Maria Torres, who was Daniel's mother, and who had apparently been recruited into the celebration with tremendous enthusiasm. There was roasted chicken and corn and fresh bread, and a cake that was perhaps not perfectly symmetrical but was very good, and they sat around the big table in the kitchen and ate and talked and laughed, and Margaret sat at that table and felt the specific, profound satisfaction of being exactly where she had chosen to be. After everyone else had gone to their separate quarters, she and Clyde sat alone on the porch in the warm September night, looking out at the land under a sky blazing with stars, and she thought about the telegram in her apron pocket in April, and the red dirt road and the sick room with the closed curtains, and the feeling of a city waking her up to things she had not previously allowed herself to want. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that Beecham's telegram described you as a man who was dying," she said. He laughed. "That was the general consensus. I'm glad it was wrong." He took her hand. "I am profoundly glad it was wrong." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they were quiet together, which was one of her favorite things about them, the comfortable inhabited quality of their silences, the way they could sit without speaking and the silence was full rather than empty. "The Fletcher matter is resolved," he said after a while. "I know, Beecham's letter came yesterday. Prior appropriation held. Fletcher's been told to remove the diversion." "Good," she said. "Now you can stop thinking about it." "I stopped thinking about it weeks ago," he said. "I had other things to think about." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Very flattering. It's the truth." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I was thinking about a woman who argued with my death and then argued with me about getting out of bed, and who sits in my kitchen discussing water law over coffee. I'm a woman of many interests," she said. "Evidently," he said. "I'm counting on the rest of my life to discover all of them." The autumn came in gold and amber, the grasslands of the Panhandle turning colors that were beautiful in their own stark way, and Margaret settled into the rhythms of the ranch with the complete attention she brought to everything. She did not give up her nursing. There was too much need for it, and she was too skilled to simply stop. But she shifted the context of it. She organized a more formal system for treating the ranch hand's medical needs, with a regular time twice a week when anyone who needed to see her could come to the kitchen, and she would treat what needed treating. Word spread in the way it always did in the Panhandle, quietly, from one ranch to the next, and she began to see the occasional neighbor's family as well, people who had no access to a physician and who rode hours to reach her. Clyde supported this unreservedly, which she had expected and been glad to have confirmed. He understood that this was part of who she was and had never suggested otherwise. He even in November rode into Hereford with her to purchase a proper supply of medicinal goods, proper bandaging, catgut thread for sutures, carbolic acid for wound cleaning, laudanum for genuine pain, and a substantial new stock of the herbs and compounds she used for the treatment she had developed through long practice. "You're building a practice," he said as they loaded the supplies into the wagon. "I'm meeting a need," she said, "which is the same thing, really." "You could hang a sign," he offered. She looked at him. "I don't need a sign. They know where to find me." He loaded the last crate and climbed up beside her on the wagon seat and clicked to the horses, and they rolled out of Hereford into the enormous October afternoon. And she thought that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon on a wagon on a dirt road in the Texas Panhandle, was the best thing she had felt in a very long time. The winter of 1882 was milder than the previous one had been, for which Margaret was grateful on Clyde's behalf in a way she suspected she would always be, a particular attentiveness to cold, damp weather and its possibilities that she doubted would ever entirely leave her. She watched him through the cold months for any sign of return, any grayness in his color, any shortness of breath, and found none. He was entirely, robustly well, filling up the house and the yard and the dinner table with a vigor that sometimes made her stop and simply look at him, remembering the man in the bed with the labored breathing and feel a deep, clean gratitude. He caught her at this more than once. "You're checking my color," he said one December morning. "I'm not," she said. "You absolutely are," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made the accusation entirely affectionate. "My lungs are clear, Margaret. I know they are. You checked last week." That was thorough. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her temple. "Thank you for worrying." "I don't worry," she said with very little conviction. "You do," he said. "You are magnificent at worrying while appearing not to." Roy Stanton, who had been sitting at the kitchen table eating his biscuit with the studied neutrality of a man pretending not to have heard any of this, made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh, and then became extremely interested in the ranch accounts. In the early spring of 1883, a morning in March, when the Panhandle was still cold but the quality of the light was beginning to change, the days lengthening with a slow insistence that felt like a promise, Margaret found herself in the kitchen before Clyde was up, making tea with a somewhat delicate stomach, and understood what this meant. She sat with it for a few days, wanting to be certain, wanting also to have a moment with the knowledge before she shared it, because she was someone who liked to understand her own responses to things before she had to navigate anyone else's. She felt, she discovered, a happiness that was so large and unexpected that she had to keep stopping in the middle of whatever she was doing to simply breathe around it. She told him on a Thursday evening after supper, when they were alone in the kitchen, and the last of the day's light was golden through the window. She simply said it, direct and clear, the way she said everything, and watched his face do what she had never seen it do before. Went completely, utterly still for a full 3 seconds before breaking into an expression of such unguarded joy that it made her eyes sting, because she had not until that moment fully understood how much this would mean to him. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms with a gentleness that had the same quality as his strength, absolute and careful, and held her without saying anything for a long moment, and she could feel, against her cheek, the steady, strong heartbeat that she had listened to so many times with professional attention and now heard with an entirely different kind. "When?" he said finally. "October," she said, "or thereabouts." He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "My stomach is a little unsettled in the mornings, but that's entirely normal at this stage. I want Dr. Farlow to come out." "You told Dr. Farlow to get out of this house," she pointed out. "I'll write him a polite letter," he said. "For you," she laughed. "I delivered a child in 1880, Clyde. I know what I'm doing." "You are not delivering yourself," he said with a firmness that she found simultaneously exasperating and deeply touching. "No," she agreed. "I'll accept a visit from a physician in a few months' time, but there is nothing to worry about right now, and I need you to trust me on that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I trust you," he said, with the quiet completeness of a man who means it entirely. "Good," she said. "Then come sit with me." They sat together at the kitchen table in the long spring evening, planning and talking and occasionally lapsing into comfortable silence. And she thought about how different this was from every other evening she had spent, how the same room, the same table, the same Texas night outside the window could contain so much more than it had before. The spring and summer of 1883 passed with the particular quality of a period of life that is both ordinary and not ordinary at all. The days full of work and weather, and the hundred small urgencies of ranch life. And beneath all of it, this private, steady transformation. She continued her nursing work, which Clyde fretted about increasingly as the summer advanced, and she grew visibly more pregnant, until she finally sat him down and explained the physiological realities of the situation with such calm, clinical precision that he was both reassured and somewhat alarmed by how thoroughly she knew what she was talking about, and settled into a watchful acceptance that expressed itself primarily in making sure she always had water, and that the kitchen chair had a cushion on it. Roy Stanton, who had by now been incorporated into their household in every practical sense, while maintaining the fiction of being merely the foreman, was apparently deeply invested in the coming event, because Margaret caught him 3 separate times in July, standing in the doorway of the small room at the end of the upstairs hall that Clyde had proposed as the nursery, looking at it with the expression of a man planning something. She asked him about it the 3rd time, and he reddened slightly, and said he had been thinking about whether the window frame needed new weather stripping, which was so obviously not what he had been thinking about that they both pretended to believe it and moved on. Edna, who had no such pretensions, simply began knitting in mid-June and did not stop until October. The baby came on the 14th of October, 1883, in the limestone house at the end of the red dirt road, attended by Margaret herself, Dr. Farlow, who had been written a polite letter, and had responded with a generosity that erased the awkwardness of his previous visit, and Edna Potts, who proved in this context to be someone who did not rattle under pressure, which Margaret had suspected but was glad to confirm. The baby was a boy, which surprised her and delighted Clyde in a way that he tried very hard to be calm about and was entirely unable to be. He held his son for the first time with the same careful, absolute strength with which he had always held everything that mattered to him, standing at the window with the morning light coming in, and Margaret lay in the bed and watched him and felt complete in a way that was different from every other kind of completeness she had known, not better than but deeper, a different dimension of the same essential abundance. They named him James Doyle, after no one in particular and both of them in general. The ranch settled into its new configuration, the way things do when something genuinely right has happened naturally, without resistance. James was an alert, sturdy baby who seemed, from his earliest weeks, to regard the world with the same watchful interest that characterized both his parents, and who grew into an inquisitive toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's direct gaze, and an absolute talent for locating whatever he was not supposed to be near. Roy Stanton, who had no children of his own and whose stoic exterior concealed a heart that Margaret had understood from the beginning, was considerably larger than he wanted anyone to know, became James's devoted shadow. He taught him the names of the horses before the boy was 2 years old, and by the time James was 4, he could identify every animal on the property by sight, and had opinions about their characters that were remarkably accurate. The water rights case was fully settled by early 1884, the court ruling definitively in the Doyle Ranch's favor on the basis of prior appropriation, exactly as Margaret had predicted from Kessler's 3-week kitchen table legal seminar in 1879. When Beecham rode out to deliver the final ruling, Clyde sat across from him at the kitchen table and signed the final documents with Margaret's hand on his shoulder, and Beecham, a precise, careful man who had not previously shown the slightest interest in the emotional dimensions of his clients' lives, looked at the two of them with an expression that was unmistakably warm, and said that he was very glad the earlier assessment had proven incorrect. "Which one?" Clyde asked. "The one in my first telegram," Beecham said, with what passed in him for a smile. "The dying one." "So am I," Clyde said, and covered Margaret's hand with his own. The years moved through the Panhandle with the same great rolling pace as the season's hot summers and cold winters and springs that arrived with the quality of a statement of intent. The ranch grew. Clyde resolved the last of his boundary disputes and expanded the south pasture. Roy hired 3 new hands and promoted Daniel Torres, who had grown from the quiet, dignified 18-year-old at the church door into a capable, thoughtful man of 25, who had a talent for working with horses that was plain enough to see. Maria Torres, Daniel's mother, had become something of a fixture in the kitchen alongside Edna, and the two women had developed a friendship of such thoroughness and occasional combativeness that it was essentially indistinguishable from family. Margaret's informal practice continued to grow. By 1885, she was regularly seeing patients from 4 neighboring ranches and the town of Hereford, and the twice-weekly kitchen sessions had expanded to 3, and a shelf in the hallway had been converted to a proper medical supplies cupboard that Clyde had built for her with a care and precision that told her he had spent some thought on exactly what she would need. She treated fevers and injuries and infections and difficult labors and the bone-deep tiredness that was the universal condition of working people on the frontier, and she was good at it in a way that grew rather than diminished with practice. There were hard things, because there were always hard things. There was a boy of 12 from a neighboring homestead, a child named Elias, whom she could not save from a fever that took a different course than the one she had fought in Clyde, and she came home that night and sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time before Clyde found her there, and sat beside her without asking any questions and simply stayed, which was what she needed and which he had understood without being told. There was a drought year that pressed hard on the ranch and harder on smaller operations, and Margaret did what she could for the families who were struggling, which sometimes meant medical care and sometimes meant other things, and Clyde never said a word about the supplies she gave away or asked her to account for them. There were wonderful things, too, in abundance. There was a second child, a girl, born in November of 1885, whom they named Clara, and who arrived in the world with such composure and dark-eyed attentiveness that Margaret looked at her in those first minutes and felt that she knew her already, this small person who regarded her with Clyde's eyes from a face that was entirely her own. There was the particular joy of watching James, who was 2 by then, approach his sister with a gravity and gentle curiosity that suggested he had thought carefully about how to be a good brother, and intended to practice it seriously. There was the spring morning when Clyde woke her early and led her out to the south pasture before sunrise to see the first calves of the season, dozens of them, leggy and uncertain, standing close to their mothers in the pale blue light before dawn, and she stood in the damp grass at the edge of the pasture and felt the scale of what they had built here, the living, breathing reality of it. There was the letter from Dr. Garrett in the autumn of 1886, congratulating her on what he had heard of her practice and asking if he might send a young physician in training, named Robert Sims to observe her methods for a month, which she agreed to, and which Sims made thorough use of, and which resulted in a long professional correspondence that was one of the most stimulating intellectual exchanges of her career. There was the evening Roy Stanton, who was gruff and private, and had been alone for so long that aloneness seemed structural to his character, mentioned a woman in Hereford named Berta Walsh, the widow of a former merchant, with a particular careful offhandedness that was so conspicuously studied that Margaret had to press her lips together firmly and wait a full 30 seconds before responding. At which point, she simply asked what Mrs. Walsh was like and watched Roy become the most flustered she had ever seen him, which was tremendously satisfying. Roy and Berta Walsh were married the following April, in a ceremony that was the practical and emotional inverse of Clyde and Margaret's own larger, louder and blessed, with a reception at the Hereford Hotel that generated enough music and dancing to be heard from 2 streets away. Margaret stood with Clyde on the edge of the dance floor and watched Roy dancing with considerably more enthusiasm than she would have predicted, and leaned against Clyde's shoulder and said that she was deeply glad, and he said that so was he, and that was the complete truth for both of them. By the summer of 1887, Clyde Doyle was 46 years old and Margaret was 33, and the ranch was fully in its stride, running with a competence and efficiency that reflected 15 years of Clyde's building and 5 years of Margaret's particular ability to see what was needed and provide it. James was 4, walking through the world with his father's ground-eating stride already evident in miniature, and an interest in the horses that had Roy in a state of quiet satisfaction. Clara was nearly 2, a small, certain person who already knew exactly what she wanted, and had a gift for making this clear that her parents found exhausting and deeply funny. On a morning in late July, when the heat was absolute and the range shimmered, and even the horses stood still in the shade, Margaret was in the kitchen going over her medical records when Clyde came in from the yard and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter and drank half of it, and then stood at the counter and looked at her with the expression she had first seen on the porch that night in April of 1882, that open, searching, wondering look. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking." "About?" He set down the glass and crossed to the table and sat across from her. "I was in the south pasture this morning," he said, "and I was thinking about the telegram Beecham sent you, the one that said I was dying." She looked up from her records. "What about it?" "I was thinking that of all the things I have ever been glad of in my life," he said, "the one I am most glad of is that Beecham sent that telegram and that you packed your bag and got on that train." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been her patient and then her challenge and then her companion and then her husband and who was now, in every possible sense of the word, her home. The man who had been half gone when she arrived and who had fought back to full life with a stubbornness she had respected before she loved it. The man who had listened for her laugh. The man who had built this place out of 40 acres and a mule and a great deal of will, and who had then rebuilt himself after the illness had taken him apart, and who now sat across from her at this kitchen table on a hot July morning, with water still on his upper lip from the glass and all of his dark eyes on her face. She thought about what she had planned to do with the rest of her life, which was what he had asked her, that first evening on the porch, and which she had not fully been able to answer then, because the fullness of what was possible had not yet been visible to her. She could see it clearly now. She could see it in James's face and Clara's and in the shelf of medical supplies in the hallway and in the papers on the table in front of her, the names of the families she had helped. She could see it in the south pasture and the creek that ran clean and full now that Fletcher's illegal diversion had been removed, and in Roy and Berta's Sunday visits and Edna's knitting and Daniel Torr's riding fence on the North Range with a sureness in the saddle that made even the horses behave better. She could see it most clearly in the man across the table, who had asked the question honestly and waited for a real answer, and then made space for her to become everything the answer implied. "I know what I plan to do," she said. "Do you?" He was smiling now. "I plan to keep moving forward," she said, "case to case, and I was very good at it." "You were," he said, "are." "But what I actually did," she said, and she reached across the table and took his hand, "was come to the end of that road and find something considerably better than I'd been looking for." He turned her hand in both of his and looked at it, the garnet ring, worn familiar now, the strong, steady hands that had held his life in them at the worst of it and had chosen to keep holding it after the worst was over. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "So am I," she said. "Every single day." Clara toddled into the kitchen at that moment from wherever she had been, carrying a wooden spoon with the focused determination of someone who has important work to do, and announced something in the language of almost 2-year-olds that required no translation because the intent was perfectly clear. Clyde picked her up with one arm and settled her against his side, and went back to looking at Margaret with the same expression, which Clara accepted as entirely normal because it was, in her experience, the natural state of her father's face when his wife was in the room. Margaret went back to her records with a smile she did not try to contain, and outside the window the Texas Panhandle spread itself in all its enormous, demanding, beautiful exactness under the summer sky, and the cattle moved on the range, and the horses stood in the shade, and Daniel Torres rode the fence line, and Roy and Berta were eating Sunday supper 3 miles away. And somewhere in the yard James Doyle was having an earnest conversation with a quarter horse about something that the horse appeared to find entirely reasonable, and the world went on exactly as it should. There is a moment in a life, Margaret had come to understand, when the forward motion stops being about escaping something and starts being about inhabiting something. She had been moving forward for a long time before she knew the difference. She knew it now, clearly and completely, in the same way she knew the sound of a healthy heartbeat, not because someone had told her, but because she had listened long enough to understand what was right. She had been hired to nurse a dying man. He had not died. And the question he had asked her, what she planned to do with the rest of her life, had turned out to be the question everything else had been leading toward, the one that required the most honest answer she had ever given, and which had turned out to be the best answer she had ever found. The summer heat settled over the ranch, comfortable and absolute, and Margaret Ralston Doyle finished her notes and set them aside and looked up at the man across the table, her husband, her home, the man who had been half dead in that bedroom and who now held their daughter against his chest with easy, certain strength, and the rest of her life stretched out ahead of her, not as a series of cases to move through, but as a place to be, vast and vivid and entirely her own. And she was glad of every mile of it. The garnet ring caught the morning light when she reached for her coffee, and she noticed it, as she always did, after all this time, with a small and private gratitude that belonged entirely to her, and which she would carry with her, steady and bright and unhurried, for all the years that were still coming.